Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 4. Who hath descended into heaven, or hath descended? Who hath gathered the wind in his fist? Who hath bound the waters in a garment? Who hath established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? And what is his son's name, if thou canst tell? Now, in the part 1 lesson of this teaching, we answered the question, what is the Most High's name? And we found the answer to that question in Psalm 64 and verse 8, which reads, Sing unto Elohim, sing praises to his name. Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name Yah, and rejoice before him. One of the things we took a look at in the part 1 lesson of this teaching was how different groups within our Israelite community sometimes use different names for the Most High. But what they all have in common is they all contain the short form of the Most High's name, Yah, which is given to us in the scriptures. So within this part 2 teaching, we will be addressing the question, what is his son's name? And there's a simple answer to this question that I could thoroughly cover in a few minutes, which I will do towards the end. But what I would like to do in this teaching is focus on the importance of understanding what the son's name is not. So let's start by getting an understanding of the importance of a person's name or a group of people's name as it pertains to our Israelite culture. Now, when the Most High Yah names someone or something, that name defines their purpose or their calling. Here's an example. Genesis chapter 32 verse 28, and it reads, And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel, for as a prince hast thou power with Elohim and with men, and hast prevailed. Now, Israel, by definition, means he will rule, reign as Elohim. So let's take a look at a precept that supports Genesis chapter 32. And we find that in 2nd Esdras chapter 6, verse 55 through 59. And here you have one of our ancestors, an Israelite, Esdras, having a discussion and prayer with the Most High. And this scripture shows that our ancestors, the Israelites, they understood who they were and the calling that was upon their life and what the Most High had created and called us to be. And it reads, 2nd Esdras chapter 6, verse 55 through 59. I have said all these things before you, Yahuwah, because you have said that you created the oldest age for our sake. You have said that the other nations born of Adam are nothing, and that they are like spit, and you have compared their abundance to a drop from a pitcher. But look now, Yahuwah, these nations that are valued as nothing rule over us and devour us, while we, your people, whom you have called, your oldest offspring, your one and only child, those who are zealous for you, your dearest ones, are handed over to them. If the world was created for our sake, why don't we possess our world's inheritance? How long will this situation last? So we saw in the part 1 lesson of this teaching how the enemy, Satan, understood that the Most High had a plan for a specific group of people to reign in the earth, but he was not happy with that plan. He actually wanted to rule and reign in the earth. So as a result of Satan's actions, we see in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 that the Most High stated, and it reads, And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed, and it shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So Genesis chapter 3 and 15 shows us that there will be future conflict between the enemy Satan and a chosen group of people by which the Messiah will come through. So the enemy Satan is determined to try to disrupt the Most High's plan for the earth. And one of the many ways that he goes about trying to disrupt the Most High's plan is by manipulating the other nations to do his will. We see an example of this in Psalms 83, verse 2 through 4, and it reads, "For lo, thy enemy make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." And as we stated, that whenever the Most High names something, that name defines the purpose and the calling of the individual. And as we also stated, that Israel is defined as he shall reign and rule as Elohim. And it's also very important that we keep in mind what Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 teaches us, which reads, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So we need to keep in mind that there are forces that are manipulating and influencing the nations, and that's responsible for the actions of a lot of the nations that we may find ourselves in conflict with. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 also shows us how the enemy was actually successful in obtaining rulership in this world. And he was able to accomplish that by establishing his own world system. And that world system began all the way back in the Garden of Eden, where he was able to distort the Most High's word, the truth. And over time, he was able to establish his own church, his own chosen people, a distorted version of the gospel, as well as bring about a misrepresentation of the Messiah, which would have profound impact on the chosen people, a people with a divine calling and a divine purpose. And if you take a look at Genesis chapter 3, then take a look at Revelation chapter 12, you actually get an idea of how effective his world system has been. Because in Genesis chapter 3, he began by deceiving one person, a woman. And then when you go to Revelation chapter 12, you see the scripture says that he deceived the entire world. So his system has been very effective, is still in effect, is still in motion, and is still functioning today. I actually have a teaching entitled World System that I'll be rolling out in the near future, and it goes into great detail, multiple verses and precepts to add clarity to each of those talking points or those bullets that makes up the world system. And it'll give you a very clear, precise understanding of what we're dealing with. So stay tuned for that. We're still talking about the name of the Son. And the purpose for that brief introduction is to lay the groundwork regarding understanding the importance of a name and how the enemy, Satan, has an agenda to disrupt Yah's will, and how he is behind many of the things that we do and believe today, both as a chosen people as well as every other group of people with a heart and a desire for the truth of Yah's word. So we're going to see how the enemy distorts truth and how he manipulates the nations using various tactics to try to disrupt Yah's will in the earth. And one such tactic is known as iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm literally means image breaking, and it refers to a recurring historical impulse to destroy images for religious or political reasons. Now, here's an example of iconoclasm. And there's a popular belief that the French military leader Napoleon was responsible for defacing the Sphinx statue. But historians disagree with this fable because there are drawings and sketches of the Sphinx in this condition that existed long before Napoleon even came on the scene. But this is still an act of iconoclasm because the overall motive remains the same. Now, according to Egyptian historians, a fanatical dervish named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dahar was responsible, and he is said to have hired some men to smash off the Sphinx's nose, as it was still worshipped as a false god. To this day, the Arabs refer to the Sphinx as Abdul Hul, or Father of Terror. By disfiguring the Sphinx face in this way, the fanatics also took away its identity. Here we have another group of people coming along years later, continuing in the spirit of iconoclasm by generating a computer digital image claiming that this is what the original Sphinx looked like. Changing or breaking and destroying the original image that reflected the original people and attempting to create a new identity, one that resembles a European rather than a so-called African, thereby attempting to steal the identity of the people responsible for creating the world's first advanced and civilized nation. Now, iconoclast is the name given to the person that's performing the act of iconoclasm. And iconoclast literally means image destroyer. And once again, that's referring to the individual or the group of individuals responsible for the act of iconoclasm. Okay, so we see that iconoclasm has a Greek origin. And we also find this in the book of Maccabees, where we have a historical account of the Greek Gentiles that were the world superpower and ruling oppressors of our ancestors at the time. And our ancestors were fighting back using guerrilla warfare against the Greeks' attempt at colonization. And after one such battle that didn't go so well for our ancestors retreated to a secluded place to begin to fast and pray to our Elohim for guidance and begin to turn to the scriptures and Yah's word and his promises for encouragement. And it's within 1 Maccabees chapter 3 verse 48 that we find the act of iconoclasm by the Greeks. And it reads, "And laid open the book of the law, wherein the heathen," referring to the Greeks, "has sought to paint the likeness of their images." So the Gentiles were not only stealing the ceremonial items within the temple and defiling the temple, but they were also stealing the scriptures and attempting to write themselves in it and claim it as their own. Here's an example. And I mentioned earlier how the Greeks were attempting to colonize our ancestors. And colonization, by definition, is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. And I mentioned that because it's very important that we understand that colonization and iconoclasm goes hand in hand. Here's an example. Mexico City's Cathedral Metropolitan. This is the oldest cathedral in the Americas, and like many Spanish conquistador temples and churches, it was built atop sacred Aztec ground. One of the first things they do is destroy the indigenous people's faith and religion, which also often serves as a source of inspiration and strength and encouragement, as well as their identity as a people. Here's another example. The first building built in Mérida, Mexico, it was built atop sacred Mayan ground using the same stones of the Mayan temple. So the colonizers, the oppressors, the conquistadors, they actually tore down the Mayan temple that was in the shape of a pyramid and used the exact same stones to build this church on the exact same site. And here's a photo of the outside of the house of the conquistador that led that expedition into Mexico. And on the front of his house or his palace, he has statues of himself And the statues have him standing on the severed heads of the indigenous people that he conquered. So once again, building a church was a priority for the colonizers once they first arrived, and it wasn't done out of expressing an appreciation to their God for him allowing their military campaign to be successful, but it was done primarily because establishing their religion is a vital part and component to the colonization process. And within their churches, you find the iconoclasm images. So let's do a brief recap. We saw in Genesis chapter 32 and verse 28, which reads, "And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with Elohim and with men, and hast prevailed." And we know that Israel by definition means he will rule and reign as Elohim. And we saw in Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12 how the enemy actually gained access to rulership of this world by establishing his own world system, which started in the Garden of Eden by him distorting the Most High's word and deceiving the woman. And we know that the enemy, Satan, has been manipulating the other nations to do his will. And we find an example of that in Psalms chapter 83, verse 2 through 4, which reads, "For lo, thy enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance." And once again, we know that Israel by definition means he will rule, reign as Elohim. And we also saw an example of iconoclasm in Egypt with what was done to the Sphinx. And it was stated by the historians that by disfiguring the Sphinx's face in this way, the fanatics also took away its identity. And it's within this same spirit that the Hebrew Israelite from the tribe of Judah, the Messiah's face has been disfigured in an attempt to take away his true identity as well as the identity of the chosen people. And this is a part of the enemy's plan to cut us off from being a nation, and our true calling will be no more in remembrance. So it's very important that we understand how the enemy has been working against us as a chosen people, because this is responsible for this. Hosea chapter 4 verse 6 reads, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy Elohim, I will also forget thy children." It says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge of who they are and what the scripture has to say about them. And these are just a few examples or the byproduct of a person lacking knowledge of what the Most High's word teaches, as well as knowledge of their true identity. So let's take a look at a few Bible verses. Daniel chapter 7 and verse 9, and it reads, "I beheld till the thrones were cast down, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire." Revelation chapter 1 verse 1 and verse 14. The revelation of Yeshua Mashiach, which Elohim gave unto him. Verse 14. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. Now, this is a book on anthropology, and it was written between 1923 or dates back at least to 1941. And this particular chapter is covering or talking about Negroid hair in Central Europe. And it reads, "When in 1863 and 1864, Pruner Bay by microscopic investigation of the hair of different races, arrived at the conclusion that one hair representing the ordinary characteristic trait form is sufficient to characterize the race in question. He was doubtlessly thinking chiefly of the woolly, thin, short hair of the Negro. So we see in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 9, the Most High has hair like pure wool. And in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 14, we see the sun's hairs described as wool as well. And other non-biblical sources, such as the Century Dictionary, also states that a Negro, so called for the woolly hair of his head. And prior to that, we cited a source from an anthropology book, which states the same thing regarding the distinct characteristics of the Negro's hair. So within these few verses and sources, we see that like Father, like Son, and like people, and how as a chosen people, pure wool is the hair standard that we should be striving for. So, we're still talking about the Son's name. And what I would like for us to do right now is take a little litmus test. Now, what I would like you to do in the privacy of your own home is to just close your eyes for a few seconds and say the name Jesus. So the question is, what image comes to mind when you say the name Jesus? And if you're honest and truthful, you will realize that there's no separating the Gentile European Jesus from its sole purpose that was perpetrated by the enemy, which is to disfigure the face and take away the identity of the Messiah and his chosen people, true Israel, whose purpose is to reign and rule in righteousness in the earth. So for the so-called African American, Negro, Black, Afro-Latino, or even a self-aware Hebrew, to say that the name Jesus or any other Gentile translation doesn't matter, even though the test that you just took makes it clear that you can't separate the name from the image that's etched in your psyche. This is a clear reflection of how effective the enemy's plan has been and continues to be in the lives and the mindset of Yah's chosen people. And there's truly no other reason for an informed, educated Israelite to continue to use the name Jesus, now having an understanding and realizing the effect that it has had and continues to have on our people. And there's only one exception that I can think of for that a person would continue using that name or would justify using that name. And I'll cover that towards the end of this teaching. So now let's transition to getting an understanding of translations and transliterations. Now, translations and transliterations are a blessing and are very, very important. The translation gives us the meaning of a word from a language that's different from the language that's either our own or the language that we're accustomed to speaking. And the transliteration helps us understand how the word is pronounced. Now, let's take a look at one of the driving forces behind transliterations and translations, or translations, that is. Something that most people may have never considered. Now, when considering the fact that as a people, we've been intentionally stripped of everything as it pertains to our identity. With that in mind, the following understanding and concept should be fairly easy to grasp. Translations can often and have often been used as a form of iconoclasm, image destroying or image breaking. In fact, sometime in the near future, I'll do a short teaching that basically compares the different translations. We'll look at different scriptures, different verses in the Bible, and compare them translation to translation, and you'll clearly see how the people that's behind these different versions of the Bible, these different translations, have an agenda. And it's clear how they have removed certain verses or have used certain words to justify certain behaviors and lifestyle to push and forward their agenda, as well as distort the message and the gospel and the teachings, doctrines of Yeshua and his disciple, thereby painting a different identity for our Messiah and our ancestors. So stay tuned for that teaching. Now back to translations and transliterations. Now, a name is a word, and words have meaning that are attached to them. And a collection of words makes up our vocabulary. We add to our vocabulary throughout our lives. It's something that's constant in life. Now, to give you an example, just think of some of the new slang that exists today that didn't exist last year. That's part of, a person's vocabulary. So the question is, why change a name which is a word that is sacred? It's just another word with a meaning to add to our ever-expanding vocabulary. And the answer for changing the word or name is iconoclasm, image breaking, and changing the identity that's associated with the true name. Now, to some, that may sound like a religious conspiracy theory, but let's connect the dots by taking a look at a few historical events. And please remember, it's very important that we remember Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12 teaches us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but there are spiritual forces behind the nation's actions towards the chosen. So let's take a close look at the history of the Christian church. Now, 312 years after the last emissary, after the last true disciple walked the earth, the Romans, under the leadership of Constantine, took over the so-called church. And the doctrine of Yeshua and his original disciples was no longer in the hands of the chosen people, but now in the hands and control of Gentiles. And anything that reinforced and was related to the original doctrine, true Messiah, his disciples, and the chosen people was forbidden by the Gentiles that had now taken over the church. And remember, iconoclasm means image breaking for religious and political reasons. This also included the Hebrew name of the Elohim of Israel, Yahuwah, and his son Yeshua our Messiah. These names are too distinctively Hebrew and contrary to the Gentiles' culture and the identity of those that are now running the so-called church. Now, this form of iconoclasm forbade early believers from following the culture of Yeshua and the early disciples. If you observed Sabbath instead of Sunday worship, which was mandated by Rome, if you kept the law, statutes, and commandments, such as dietary laws, observed Passover rather than Easter, and not participate in Mithra's birthday and Saturnalia, which today is called Christmas, then you were accused of Judaizing and was referred to as a Judaizer by the so-called church fathers. Now, let's not confuse what was happening among some of our people and leaders from the southern kingdom that were being rebellious towards the gospel by trying to convince others that they did not need to have faith in Yeshua, that they just had to turn back to the law to be in right standings with Yah. And there are certain so-called historians and Gentile scholars that would refer to this or refer to their tactics as Judaizing. That's completely separate from the historical conduct and laws implemented by the so-called Christian Church founding fathers. So let's take a look at what was happening in Acts chapter 15 and verse 1. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. So we had, again, some of our ancestors from the southern kingdom was trying to teach the other brethren that they didn't have to have faith in Yeshua. All they had to do is turn back to the law, and the Most High would be pleased with them. So let's take a look at Romans chapter 3, starting with verse 20. And it reads, Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. Verse 28. Therefore, we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law. And when you continue reading, keeping it in context, you get understanding of what Paul is speaking about. Verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? Elohim forbid. Yea, we establish the law. Or in other words, do we do away with the law, which is defined as the Most High's instructions, because we now have faith in Yeshua? Elohim forbid. No, on the contrary, we establish the law because we have faith in Yeshua, and we're following his example, and he kept the law perfectly. Not that we will keep the law perfectly, but we're still called to walk according to the Spirit, which is the law, to the best of our ability. And when we come up short, we have an intercessor to intercede for us. So once again, the law outlines our culture, and it was given to us as a chosen people, as a chosen nation, to set us apart from all others. And blessings and promises will always follow obedience. The enemy knows it, so that's why he's endeavoring from the very beginning to prevent us from walking according to our culture, which is found within the law. So don't allow some false doctrine teacher try to guilt trip you into believing that you have a work-based salvation. So Acts chapter 15 and Romans chapter 3, that's completely separate from the historical conduct and the laws implemented by the so-called Christian Church founding fathers. And once again, Judaizing was the forbidding of early believers from observing the culture, customs, traditions, and original doctrine of the Hebrew Israelite Messiah and his disciples. So once again, Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 4. The question is, what is his son's name? But more importantly, what isn't his son's name? And we know that the son's name is not Jesus, which is this guy right here. Now, that name has become cliche, which by definition means trite or an overused phrase or expression. And it's also a phrase or opinion that is overused and betrays a lack of original thought. Or in other words, that name is not the original name that the Most High had in mind for his son, because we understand that the name defines the purpose or the calling that's upon the individual whenever the Most High names something or someone. It's not reverenced or honored by so-called believers or non-believers. Both groups use that name flippantly, and it's often used by both so-called believers and non-believers casually. So there's no genuine reverence, genuine deep down reverence for that name, and that's a part of the enemy's plan. So back to Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 4. Now, this question is coming from a Hebrew Israelite whose royalty and considered the wisest man on the earth, King Solomon, who understands that the son in question would come from his bloodline, who would also be royalty, and is prophesied to sit on the throne of his father King David forever. So now, having a little insight into where the question, or who the question, is coming from, do you think the answer to his question is option A, a Gentile translation, or option B, a Hebrew name from a Semitic language? And keep in mind, we want the answer to the question that's coming from a Hebrew Israelite. So obviously the answer is a Hebrew name from a Semitic language. So having answered that question, let's take a look at the name Yeshua. Now, Yeshua comes from the root word Yasha, and it's defined as Savior, to save, be delivered, to liberate, be victorious, help, and salvation. Now, Yeshua is a combination of the names Joshua and Hosea. Joshua, pronounced Yehoshua, is defined as Elohim is salvation, and Hosea, pronounced Hoshea, is defined as salvation. And components of those two names combined gives us the name Yeshua. And as we stated in the beginning of this teaching, whenever the Most High names someone, that name defines their purpose and their calling. And in Acts chapter 4 and verse 12, we find, "Neither is there salvation in any other, for there is none other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved." So we see in Acts chapter 4 verse 12 that salvation has a name, and that name is Yeshua. Now, some may be thinking, why not Yehoshua or Yahshua, which we find the name of the Father Yahuwah within them. Now, these are in fact correct translations and Hebrew names of our Messiah, but the reason why this teaching focuses on the name of Yeshua is because Yeshua is the Hebrew Aramaic dialect that was spoken during the time that Yeshua walked the earth. And this is the name that he was referred to and known by. And we see this in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 46, which reads, "And about the 9th hour, Yeshua cried with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?" That is to say, my Elohim, why hast thou forsaken me? So Matthew chapter 26 and verse 46 gives us an example of the Hebrew Aramaic dialect of his day. So that's why this teaching focuses on the name Yeshua as opposed to the other Hebrew names, which are also correct. So what if you're still struggling with the name Jesus and the images, the Gentile image? Here are a few recommendations. Remember the images and the impact that the name Jesus and the image of Jesus has had and continues to have on our community. Trust in the word of the Most High, that it will do what it promises to do in John chapter 8 and verse 32, which tells us that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. You'll be surprised to see how, with the more truth you receive, biblical truth, how all those other things fall away. Truth will always resonate within us as a chosen people. And Yeshua made it clear when he said, "My sheep hear my voice," which is the truth of his word. And he said, "I know them and they follow me." So if you have a genuine, sincere thirst and hunger and desire for truth, then trust me when I say that the Most High is true to his word. He will do his part to bring you out. And probably most importantly, reverence the word and the name of Yeshua, and be intentional in your use of it. No more cliche, casual use. Leave that mindset and reverence the Hebrew name that's asked for in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 4. A name that's associated with our culture and our ancestors' native tongue. And always keep in mind that this is our culture that we are endeavoring to reconnect with, and that you are responsible for passing it down to your children. You are now in a position to contribute to breaking that cycle that has caused our people to be destroyed because they lack knowledge regarding His chosen people. Now, I mentioned early on in this teaching that there is only one excuse for using the name Jesus or Jesus that I could think of, and that I would address that towards the end of the teaching. And the only reason that I can think of for an informed, educated, knowledgeable Hebrew Israelite to use that name is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 19 through 26. And it reads, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law towards Elohim, but under law towards Mashiach, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some." So to summarize what Paul is saying is, when sharing truth with people, we meet them where they are. If someone's only familiar with the name Jesus or Jesus, then I will meet them where they are by using the name Jesus or Jesus in our conversation, because the ultimate goal is to share truth. And the last thing that we want to do as a people with wisdom and knowledge and a heart and desire to share truth is cause our message to be lost in the delivery, because we refuse to meet people where they are in their understanding of what the Most High's word truly teaches. And that's by no means saying that we're going to leave them where they are, because the goal is to bring them up in their understanding up to where we are. But we keep in mind that there are stages to growth. And let's also keep in mind that relationships are often founded on acceptance. And when a relationship begins to flourish, we earn the right to share more truth. And when we share more truth, we believe the Most High's word that says that the truth shall set them free from those things that are preventing them from obtaining the relationship that the Most High desires to have with them. So to once again summarize what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians is, we meet people where they are with the ultimate goal of helping them to be in right standings with the Most High. So that's the only reason that I can think of that a mature, informed, and educated Hebrew Israelite would use that name. A name that's inseparable from the deceptive image that has had a negative impact on the mindset of our people and community to this very day. So in light of all these facts, there's no other reason to choose to use a translation that's become a cliche over the Hebrew name that's asked for in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 4. A name that's consistent with our true culture as a people, a culture that should be embraced and celebrated because it was given only to us, the chosen people. And as I've stated before, so much has been stripped and taken away from us as a people. And we've seen in the scriptures and throughout history how it's the enemy's plan to cut us off from being a people with a divine calling and purpose. But now we're reclaiming our true identity and our true culture, and we are unapologetic for it. Baruch chapter 4, verse 1 through 6, and it reads, This is the book of the commandments of Elohim, and the law that endureth forever. All they that keep it shall come to life, but such as leave it shall die. Turn thee, O Jacob, and take hold of it. Walk in the presence of the light thereof, that thou mayest be illuminated. Give not thine honor to another, nor the things that are profitable unto thee to a strange nation. O Israel, happy are we, for things that are pleasing to Elohim are made known unto us. Be of good cheer, my people, the memorial of Israel. Ye were sold to the nations, not for your destruction, but because ye moved Elohim to wrath, ye were delivered unto the enemies. So, although we've been sold to the nations and delivered unto the enemies, we have a Redeemer. We have help, a Savior, and we have a Deliverer. And we have salvation. And according to Acts chapter 4 and verse 12, salvation's name is Yeshua. And there is no other name under heaven whereby we must be saved. And when our Savior returns, he will gather his chosen, reestablish divine order in the earth, and we shall reign with him in righteousness in the earth, fulfilling our purpose and calling as a chosen people, Israel. So what is his name? His name is Yah, according to Psalms chapter 68 and verse 4. And what is his son's name? His name is Yeshua, according to Acts chapter 4 and verse 12. If you enjoy our basic Israelite teachings, please like, subscribe, and share our channel with anyone else you believe may be blessed by our teachings. So until the next time, I bid you Shalom.